questions that later I think will generate some conversations with folks. And I have experiences of my own, and as well as other histories that we can point to about contemplating ways of moving forward with Occupy. You know, and I think in some ways we're hearing some similar experiences in other parts of the world, but we're also in a very different place. So for me, this question of the relationship to the state, any form of negotiation at this point doesn't seem to make sense, because on the one end, we're readily dismissed as you know, people who don't take baths and are just mad that we're not as wealthy as everyone else. And then on the other end, the you know, more progressive end of the Democratic Party, there's co-optation. And I think any attempt to negotiate with the state will you know, result in you know, our own erasure and then becoming co-opted into electoral politics. Meanwhile, I don't think any kind of direct confrontation with the state necessarily makes sense at this point. So for me, I guess what makes the most sense is to create these you know, prefigurative experiences. And I was first drawn to Occupy Wall Street because I saw potential for a mass movement that for once didn't take as a given that one should take the state or alter the state. And there's obviously not consensus within the movement about this question of autonomy and the relationship to the state. But there aren't necessarily things that are taken as a given in these questions. So for me, I think some of the deeper questions is if we can, in fact, not have this direct relationship with the state, and what kind of alternatives can we put in place in the immediacy, and how do we do so in a way that does not necessarily replicate the dynamics of the state and perpetuate that hierarchy and forms of oppression? And how do we also do so in a way that avoids insularity? How do we combat power with to combat power over? So we can look to different forms of evidence within the Occupy movement, which I'll speak to, but obviously there are many outside of the Occupy movement, of ways that don't recognize the legitimacy of existing political structures and institutions, but instead will create our alternative models in a prefigurative ways. And so I think one thing is, on September 10th, when we were still organizing to the lead up on September 17th, the General Assembly in Tompkins Square Park reached a consensus that there would be no police liaisons. And this was reaffirmed the second day into the occupation. And I found this really exciting because, once again, this was not my experience in previous work, that we were able to redefine how we thought about politics, that it didn't have to be in relationship to the state, that we didn't have to recognize their legitimacy in any way. And the very tactic of occupation as not being your traditional permitted march, but one that does not request permission from the state to gather, but instead we'll just do it in this form of direct action. And there have been many subsequent forms of direct action that have come out of this movement, which I think is one of the more exciting elements. That's a break from this traditional protest, and also the framework of demands that, again, there's not necessarily consensus on that in the movement, but it's not taken as a given that we must issue demands to the state. And again, it repeats this dynamic where we're not recognizing their legitimacy, we're not going to them to ask for help, we're going to come together and solve problems ourselves. And I think also this question of demands that that we're not, I think for me, demands, the framework of it is simply a slightly less passive way of asking for something from the state. And whatever they do have, we take. and anything else we'll create amongst ourselves. I want to just speak very briefly about my involvement in two particular working groups in Occupy Wall Street as examples of things that we can consider as we move forward about what are some alternative institutions that we can create, and how can we do so in a way that does not perpetuate the dynamics of the state. So one, early on, there was this question about patriarchy being manifested in Occupy Wall Street, and there were these conversations that took place about people not necessarily feeling safe sleeping there, and just wider issues of oppression. So this question of how do we address accountability is not an easy one. It's quite complex, and not one that I particularly have answers for, which is something that I'd like to hear for other people as well, is how do we solve conflicts that will inevitably arise in these communities in a way that does not perpetuate the same kind of punitive measures of the criminal justice system, and how do we address behavior rather than attacking individuals, and some of these other questions. The other final experience I want to talk about is the planning for May Day, which is one of the things I'm most excited about moving forward with this movement. Again, the demands discussion is not so much coming up, where I think many folks are past that kind of idea. And my work in particular is coordinating mutual aid throughout the city on this day, in preparation for a possible general strike, day without the 99%, other types of names for this action. And what I see is mutual aid as a possibility to show that we don't need the state to provide ourselves, and we don't need to mimic the paternalism of a welfare state, that we can instead look to one another, that we all have skills and values that we can exchange with one another in a way that does not require this relationship to the state. So those are just a few ideas of little experiences of my own that I can point to as ideas of, as we're moving forward with this movement, how we can do so in not these questions of negotiating with the state or being co-opted by them.
Okay. So I think the Occupy movement was sort of this collective unleashing of anger. Sorry, am I speaking loud enough?
Yeah, that's better.
The Occupy movement was this collective unleashing of anger in response to the financial crisis, but it was also a response to the delegitimizing of the state and its role as arbiter of capital. And I think, that takes different forms globally, but in the United States, it's taken the form of the total delegitimization of the U.S. Congress and of the executive. There was a New York Times poll in October that showed a 9% approval rating of the U.S. Congress, at the same time that the Occupy Wall Street movement and Occupy movement had 50, 60% support among the general population. So I think that speaks to where people are. They're not necessarily buying into mainstream narratives about how we're all a bunch of dirty hippies and asking for jobs or whatever, or that we're lazy. I think people really are ready for a different kind of governance and a different kind of experience in relation to one another. But they don't necessarily know how to manifest it because they're coming from a system that is hierarchical and patriarchal, and so we end up in the movement replicating all of these same structures and problems. And so Matt and I have been working in different ways, but I think what Savers Spaces has been doing and what we've been trying to do with facilitation and with certain processes is attempting to address that, attempting to address how we cannot replicate these same things in our own autonomous spaces. So that's one thing. I wanted to touch on the question of resources, because this came up earlier with Argentina and Venezuela, and we're never. I think it's an incredibly difficult position to be in, to try to create parallel institutions and autonomous spaces without any resources, or maybe we can rethink or reimagine what we mean by resources. And actually, I mean, in Occupy Wall Street, recently we've been doing a series of conversations, community dialogues around power, privilege, and access to resources as a way to sort of get at this problem, because resources aren't just, money, it's not just cash. I mean, as was mentioned before, land donations, building donations, these sorts of things can be much more helpful. And so the question is, like, how can you access the resources that enable you to retain some kind of autonomy or build more autonomy within the existing system? And I don't think we've managed to do that within Occupy by any means. I think we've begun to sort of see the possibility of self-management and autonomy through the working group structure and through spokes council, but that hasn't entirely manifested itself. So we started this series of dialogues to try to begin that conversation, to identify what it is we actually need to sustain the work that we're doing and to build alternative institutions. And and I think, like Occupy Farms is one really interesting example of an experiment in taking back the land and making it into something that is more self-sustaining and contributing to the movement. So I'd like to talk about that, and I'd like to talk about how we can, in general, connect these internal working groups within Occupy to existing institutions and alternative economic models. Because right now, I mean, especially coming out of so in the park, we had this very sort of internal experiment in autonomy and in participation, but it was just centered around the encampment itself, right, and how to sustain that. And now, post-raid, post-eviction, we really need to look at how we can do that in the society at large, and how we can do it, in the neighborhood level, and really, connect the assemblies, but also build more sustainable. I mean, I think the assembly models that we're using, the General Assembly has a very individualistic approach, and it's not very consistent, especially in a metropolitan area like New York City. You have a lot of transients, you have people coming in who are interested but not necessarily invested in the same way, they're not stakeholders in the same way, and so there's a lack of accountability in the General Assembly model itself. I think it's a great space for organizing and outreach and to connect people to the movement, but it's not necessarily something that can be sustained. And so I think a spokes council kind of model, or model like we are talking about in Venezuela, with these communes, basically, is something that maybe we need to think about moving forward. How can we build confederated models, or maybe even federated, although I'm wary of that. I think that's a good starting point, but I also I still have a lot of questions about what that means in the long term. I don't think right now we're in a position to, this question of negotiation is interesting because, we're always negotiating in a way, even if we're not negotiating on this sort of structural scale. We're negotiating space, we're negotiating speech, we're negotiating our right to sort of exist. And I don't really mean to use the rights framework, but that we're constantly trying to find ways to exist within the current system and move beyond it. And so I think, that it's an ongoing process, that it's not just this point of ultimate negotiation, or we're far from an armed struggle situation where we actually have dual power and there's some sort of confrontation, I think. But leading up to that, we need to think of what the process is going to look like. And I guess I think the main challenges facing us are the replication of existing patriarchy, hierarchy, and power relations from the structures that we're coming from. We're also facing disruption. We're facing state repression, and and internal violence, really. I mean, how do we deal with this question of violence? How do we manage ourselves? This is a big question. So.